I never wanted trouble. That's the first thing people need to understand. I moved to Evergreen Estates for peace. For quiet. For a fresh start. Not for battles over the color of my barn. Evergreen Estates wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect a man like me to live. It was a postcard-perfect neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and white picket fences so pristine they looked like they'd been bleached under the sun. It had the kind of charm you'd find in a magazine ad for overpriced real estate. But there was something else too. Something unspoken. You feel it before you see it. I'd been here a year, and I could count the number of black families on one hand. And the way some of the neighbors looked at me, like I was a puzzle piece forced into the wrong box. Most were polite, smiles that never quite reached their eyes, conversations that stayed surface level. But then there were people like George Whitaker, HOA president, retired banker, full-time problem. The first time I met George, he barely glanced at me before launching into a speech about neighborhood standards. How Evergreen Estates had an image to maintain. How the HOA took pride in preserving property values. He didn't say what he really meant. Didn't have to. I heard it anyway. It didn't matter that I'd bought the old Benson farm with my own hard-earned money. That I'd spent months restoring it, fixing up the house, repainting the fences, tending to the barn like it was a part of my own history. It only mattered that I was here. And now, apparently, my barn was a problem. It started small. A letter in my mailbox. Official-looking, typed in stiff, unfriendly font. A courtesy notice from the HOA. Your barn does not meet the aesthetic standards of the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association. Please repaint or remove the structure within 30 days to comply. I frowned. The barn was red. Classic red. The kind you'd see in every countryside painting, every Americana postcard. It wasn't an eyesore. It was history. I figured it was a mistake. Maybe some overzealous rule enforcer trying to make a name for themselves. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I ignored it. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one less polite. Failure to comply will result in fines of $100 per day until resolution. I felt the first spark of anger then, but I pushed it down. This was just paperwork. Bureaucracy. Someone with too much time on their hands. I'd sort it out. Then George showed up at my doorstep. It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind where the sky stretched wide and blue over the rolling hills. I had a wrench in my hand, halfway through fixing a loose hinge on my gate, when his navy blue SUV rolled up my driveway like he owned the place. He stepped out, crisp polo tucked into khaki slacks, sunglasses perched on his nose. The man carried himself like a judge stepping up to the bench. "Morning, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone thick with forced pleasantries. I wiped my hands on my jeans, not bothering to smile. "Morning." He glanced around, nostrils flaring slightly, like the fresh country air was personally offending him. Then his gaze landed on the barn. "You got our notices, I assume." I did. And I folded my arms. And I don't see what the problem is. George sighed. A patient, patronizing sound. The problem is, that barn doesn't fit the aesthetic standards of our community. Aesthetic standards, I repeated slowly. It's a barn. Yes, but it's very visible from the main road. We've had complaints. I tilted my head. From who? He smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. That's confidential. My jaw tightened. I knew what this was. I knew exactly what this was. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me angry. I smiled right back. "Well, Mr. Whitaker, if you can show me the specific rule that says my barn can't be red, I'll be happy to reconsider." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "It's about harmony, Mr. Carter. About maintaining a certain standard." I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and unmoving. He was waiting for me to bend, to nod, to apologize for daring to exist in his perfect little world with my out-of-place barn. Instead, I said, "I'll think about it." George's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded once, then turned back toward his car. But before he got in, he said something that made my skin prickle. I'd hate for this to become a bigger issue. A threat, wrapped in polite wording. I watched his SUV disappear down my driveway, the engine's growl fading into the morning air. And that was when I made my decision. They didn't like my barn?
Fine.
I'd painted the brightest, most obnoxious shade of pink they'd ever seen. I could feel the shift before I saw it. It started with the looks. I'd be out in my yard, fixing a fence post or tending to the garden, and I'd catch them watching, neighbors who'd never so much as waved before, suddenly slowing their morning walks to stare at my property. Their eyes lingered too long on the barn. Then came the whispers. At the grocery store. At the gas station. People I barely knew lowering their voices when I passed, their conversations dissolving into polite nods and tight smiles. But the real confirmation came 3 days after George's visit. A third letter. Final warning. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action. I read it twice, the words sinking like a stone in my chest. Immediate legal action? Over a barn?
No.
This wasn't about the barn. It never had been. Still, I wasn't breaking any rules. I double-checked the HOA guidelines, combing through every section like a lawyer preparing for trial. Nowhere did it say barns couldn't be read. No mention of color restrictions at all. But I knew how these things worked. Rules didn't have to be written when certain people were involved. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The walls of my own home, felt thinner, more vulnerable. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the country, the rustling of the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. But underneath it, something felt off. And then, around midnight, I heard it. A low hum, the sound of an engine idling somewhere nearby. I got up, pulled back the curtain. Headlights flickered just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards from my barn. A car.
Parked.
Watching. A chill ran down my spine. I moved fast, slipping on my boots, grabbing my flashlight, stepping onto the porch as quietly as I could. But by the time I reached the edge of my property, the engine revved, tires crunching over gravel as the vehicle sped off into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, breath misting in the cold night air. Coincidence?
No.
This was something else. The next morning, I found the damage. Spray paint. Black letters scrawled across the barn door. Get out. I inhaled sharply, stared at the words, fresh and ugly against the red wood. A threat.
Not subtle this time.
Not wrapped in legalese or fake smiles. I clenched my jaw, my fingers curling into fists. I wasn't going anywhere. If they thought this would scare me into leaving, they had the wrong man. I walked to my shed, grabbed a can of primer, and started painting over the graffiti. But as I rolled the paint over those hateful words, a new idea formed in my mind. If they hated red this much, they were really gonna hate pink. By the time I finished painting over the graffiti, my decision was made. They wanted to bully me?
Fine.
I'd make sure they had something real to complain about. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought 5 gallons of the brightest, most electric pink paint I could find. The color was called Bubblegum Blast, and it was loud. The kind of pink that burned into your vision long after you looked away. I spent the entire weekend repainting the barn. With every stroke of my brush, I thought about the looks, the threats, the way people like George Whitaker thought they could dictate who belonged and who didn't. By Sunday evening, it was done. The barn was magnificent, a neon pink monument to my defiance. I sat on my porch with a cold beer, admiring my work, waiting for the storm to come.
And it did.
The complaint. Monday morning, I found George Whitaker in my driveway. He wasn't alone. 2 other HOA board members flanked him, both white, both wearing expressions like they'd just stepped in something foul. George adjusted his sunglasses, looking up at the barn like it personally offended him. "Mr. Carter," he said, voice tight. "What is this?" I sipped my coffee. "My barn." George inhaled through his nose, clearly working to keep his temper in check. "This is not in compliance with community standards." "Funny," I said. I read the HOA guidelines cover to cover. No mention of color restrictions. One of the board members, a rail-thin woman with a pearl necklace, chimed in. "There's an implied standard, Mr. Carter. Evergreen Estates values tasteful aesthetics." I let that word settle between us. Tasteful. I knew exactly what she meant. I leaned against my porch railing. So, let me get this straight. A red barn was a problem, but a pink barn is an even bigger problem? George's jaw twitched. You're being difficult. I smiled.
No.
I'm following the rules. His patience snapped. I'm issuing a formal violation, he said, pulling a clipboard from his folder. You'll be fined $500 a day until this is corrected. I whistled low.
That's steep.
You sure that's legal? He didn't answer. Because it wasn't. HOA fines couldn't exceed $100 a day. I'd read that rule, too. But I didn't call him on it. Not yet. I had a better idea. The pattern. The next week, the harassment escalated. It started with anonymous complaints, noise violations when I hadn't made a sound, parking violations when my truck was neatly in my driveway. Then came the damage. My mailbox was smashed. My garden trampled. My porch light shattered. And late one night, I heard footsteps crunching outside my barn. By the time I got outside, all I found was a slashed tire on my truck and the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. They wanted me gone. The investigation. I needed proof. So I installed cameras. Not just 1 or 2, 6. Hidden around my property, tucked under eaves and behind fences. Motion activated. Night vision. And I waited. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, just past midnight, I got an alert on my phone. Someone was on my property. I pulled up the footage and my stomach tightened. A man in a hoodie, spray can in hand, creeping toward my barn. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Emergency services. Yes, I have a trespasser on my property. I have live security footage. The line clicked. Silence. I pulled the phone away, stared at the screen. Call ended. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. I cursed under my breath. Either this was the worst possible coincidence, or someone at dispatch didn't want to help me. I gritted my teeth. Fine. If the system wasn't going to protect me, I'd protect myself. I sent the footage to a backup drive. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer. And then, just for good measure, I forwarded it to a local news reporter I knew from back in the city. By morning, my barn wouldn't just be an HOA problem. It would be everybody's problem. By the next morning, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Someone, I wonder who, had forwarded an official HOA complaint to every resident in Evergreen Estates. The subject line? Community alert. Unacceptable property violation. It included a picture of my barn, glowing like a pink sunrise, with a note from George Whitaker himself. This is a clear violation of our neighborhood's values. Further action will be taken. Further action. I barely had time to finish my coffee before a small army of HOA board members showed up at my driveway. George led the charge, of course. Today, he wore his power like a tailored suit, chin high, voice clipped, surrounded by his usual lackeys. A few neighbors lingered nearby, pretending to water their plants, pretending not to eavesdrop. But I saw their eyes flick between me and the barn, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. I set my mug down and stepped onto the porch. George didn't waste time. Mr. Carter, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. It's time we put an end to this nonsense. I crossed my arms. This nonsense being my property? This eyesore, he snapped, motioning toward the barn. You were warned. Repeatedly.
You refused to comply.
The board has voted, and as of today, we're moving forward with legal action. He said it with a smirk, like he was expecting me to fold right then and there. I didn't. Instead, I tilted my head. Legal action, huh? That's interesting. George's expression flickered, just for a second. But I caught it. We're within our rights, he pressed. Your blatant disregard for community standards is unacceptable. You're looking at thousands of dollars in fines. And if you refuse to pay, he flashed his teeth, we will place a lien on your property. I let the silence stretch between us. Let him marinate in his own arrogance. Then, slowly, I pulled my phone from my pocket. See, George, I've done my own research. I tapped the screen. Turns out Evergreen Estates has a long history of selectively enforcing HOA rules. especially against homeowners who look like me. A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. George stiffened. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. We treat everyone equally. Oh, that's not what the data says. I turned my phone around, showing a spreadsheet, dates, complaints, fines. Every single HOA enforcement action over the past 5 years. And the pattern was clear. Black homeowners? Fined at nearly triple the rate of white homeowners. I had the receipts. And I wasn't done. I swiped to a different screen. Security footage. Let's talk about harassment, shall we? I hit play. The video showed a hooded figure creeping onto my property. A spray can in hand. Defacing my barn. A collective gasp. And then the cherry on top, I zoomed in.
Clear as day.
One of George's own HOA board members. The same woman standing beside him now. Pearl necklace and all. The color drained from George's face. This proves nothing, he stammered. Oh, I think it proves plenty, I countered. Like how you and your little committee have been targeting me from day one. Like how you've been manufacturing violations. Like how someone at dispatch mysteriously dropped my 911 call while my property was being vandalized. I turned my gaze to the crowd. Tell me, neighbors, how much do you think a discrimination lawsuit against the HOA would cost? A real murmur now. Uneasy shifting. People exchanging glances. Then another voice. I think the real question, a woman near the back said, stepping forward, is how many other homeowners have been targeted and just didn't fight back. I looked at her. She was white, mid-40s, someone I'd only seen in passing. But her arms were crossed. Her expression was hard. She wasn't alone. Other neighbors were watching George now. Watching him squirm. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He straightened his shoulders, grasping for control. This is absurd, he snapped. None of this changes the fact that Mr. Carter is in clear violation of HOA standards. I smirked. Yeah. I tapped my phone again. Because the local news station disagrees. Another video. This one? A reporter. Standing right in front of my barn. Homeowner claims racial discrimination from HOA over property color, she said into the camera. Meanwhile, records show the HOA has never enforced color restrictions on any other property. I lifted my eyes to George. Should be airing and about. I checked my watch. 15 minutes. The silence was beautiful. George's face twisted. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew he was cornered. I smiled. Now, I said, you could keep pushing this. But something tells me you don't want the kind of attention that comes with a lawsuit and a media scandal. A pause. A long one. Then finally, George broke. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting to the crowd, to the board member beside him, to the woman who had spoken up. The battle was lost. He knew it. We'll discuss this further at the next board meeting, he muttered, turning on his heel. I let him walk away. Because I had already won. George Whitaker was unraveling. The confrontation in my driveway had rattled him, but it was nothing compared to what came next. By noon, the local news station had aired the segment. My bright pink barn blazed across every screen in the county, framed by words like HOA discrimination and selective enforcement in affluent neighborhood. They played the footage of my property being vandalized. They showed the spreadsheet of fines disproportionately targeting black homeowners. They even dug up other complaints against George from former residents, people who had sold their homes to escape his rule, people who now felt emboldened to speak up. And then, because karma has a way of delivering spectacularly, an investigative reporter found something even better. George Whitaker had a past. A very inconvenient past. The scandal breaks. By dinner time, another news report surfaced. This one went deeper. Turns out, George wasn't just an HOA tyrant, he was a fraud. Before moving to Evergreen Estates, he had been forced out of his last position as president of a different HOA for embezzling HOA funds. The numbers were damning. Tens of thousands of dollars in mismanaged fees. Fake repair invoices. Funds that mysteriously vanished under his leadership. He had resigned quietly before an official investigation could begin. And now, with all this new attention, that old case was being reopened. I watched the news from my porch, sipping another beer, as they showed George's smug HOA portrait beside the words, "Corrupt HOA president under scrutiny again." I almost felt bad for him. Almost. George fights back and fails. The next morning, George tried to go on the defensive. He sent an emergency, HOA-wide email. Subject: Fake news and lies about Evergreen Estates. In it, he called the reports baseless, accused the media of slandering a respected community leader, and, this part actually made me laugh, claimed that I had orchestrated a personal vendetta against him. But the damage was done. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye were now talking. At the cafe, at the post office, on Facebook. Homeowners were demanding an audit of the HOA's finances. They wanted to know where their money had gone, why fines had been issued inconsistently, why complaints seemed to target specific homeowners. And then came the real death blow. The state steps in. 2 days later, a shiny black SUV rolled into Evergreen Estates. 3 men in suits stepped out, officials from the State Housing Authority. And they weren't here for coffee. They went straight to the HOA office, armed with subpoenas. They wanted records. They wanted accounting books. And George? He looked like a man standing on a collapsing bridge. By sunset, he had locked himself inside the HOA office. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering. Someone knocked on the door. "George, they want to talk to you."
Silence.
The man who had lorded over this community for years, who had fined people into the ground for the smallest infractions, who had sent threatening letters over my barn, was now hiding like a coward. It was beautiful. The collapse. The next morning, a formal HOA meeting was called. But this wasn't just any meeting. This was an emergency recall vote. Over 50 homeowners showed up. The air was electric. The people who had once nodded along to George's rules now wanted his head on a platter. I didn't even have to speak. The numbers spoke for themselves. HOA funds were missing. Rules were selectively enforced. Lawsuits were already being filed. And then, because the universe has a fantastic sense of humor, a police officer showed up with a warrant. For George. I watched from the back of the meeting hall as he was escorted out, his face a tight mask of fury and shame. His wife trailed behind him, avoiding the eyes of the neighbors she used to look down on. People whispered. Phones snapped pictures. And just like that, George Whitaker was done. Aftermath. A new order. With George out, the HOA board scrambled to repair the damage. They repealed unfair fines. They rewrote policies to ensure fair enforcement. They even issued formal apologies to homeowners, including me. And the barn? Oh, the barn stayed pink. In fact, a few weeks later, something incredible happened. One by one, little pops of color started appearing around the neighborhood. A bright blue mailbox. A deep purple front door. A golden yellow fence. The message was clear. Evergreen Estates wasn't George's kingdom anymore. It belonged to all of us. And no matter how much they tried to push me out, I wasn't going anywhere. The last time I saw George Whitaker, he was in handcuffs. It happened on a crisp Friday morning, right in front of the HOA office. 2 officers escorted him down the brick walkway, past the neatly trimmed hedges he once ruled over like a king. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, reporters, even a few board members who had turned against him. His wife trailed behind him, face pale, clutching her pearls like they might shatter. "This is a mistake," George barked, twisting toward the officers. "I did nothing wrong." No one believed him. Not after the financial audit revealed $120,000 in missing HOA funds. Not after the state confirmed he had falsified maintenance records. Not after 3 former homeowners came forward with their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and racial discrimination under his reign. It was over. For years, he had fined, bullied, and controlled this neighborhood. Now he was the one losing everything. Justice. Delivered. The cleanup. With George gone, Evergreen Estates felt lighter. The HOA board was gutted. 2 other members resigned in disgrace, including the woman caught vandalizing my barn. The new board, led by some of the same neighbors who had once stood on the sidelines, vowed to fix what was broken. First order of business? Revoking every bogus fine George had ever issued. They wiped my record clean. I didn't owe them a single dime. I was finally free. And the barn? Still pink. Still standing. In fact, it became a bit of a symbol. A quiet rebellion against the old order. Over the next few weeks, more and more houses started embracing color. Blue shutters, yellow fences, red doors. Nothing wild, just little pops of individuality. Evergreen Estates wasn't a prison anymore. People were reclaiming their homes, their voices, their rights. A neighborhood reckoning. One afternoon, about a week after George's arrest, I was out front when a familiar figure approached. It was Linda, the older woman who had spoken up at the HOA meeting. The one who had never given me trouble before, but never stood up for me, either. She shifted awkwardly, hands clasped. I wanted to say something. I leaned against my porch railing, waiting.
She sighed.
I knew George was a piece of work, but I didn't realize just how bad it was. She hesitated, then met my eyes. I should have spoken up sooner. I let her words settle. For years, people like her had let George run unchecked. They weren't actively racist, but they let the system work against people like me. They ignored the unfair fines, the targeted rules, the way Black homeowners were scrutinized while others got a free pass.
And now?
Now, they were reckoning with their silence. I nodded.
Well,
you're speaking up now. She exhaled, relieved. Then she smiled. I like the barn, by the way. I smirked. Yeah. She glanced around, thinking about painting my door green. I chuckled. Do it before they make a new rule against joy. She laughed and walked off, and for the first time in a long time, I felt good about this place. The final word. One evening, just before sunset, I stood by my barn, running my fingers along the wooden panels. The pink paint was still bold, still defiant, but somehow, it didn't feel like a fight anymore. It felt like home. For so long, I had been the one force to defend, to prove, to push back. But I wasn't alone anymore. The neighborhood had changed. I had changed. I had stood my ground. And I had won. With a deep breath, I turned and headed inside. Evergreen Estates was finally mine, too.